the last section of Manifesto, right? We talked about like what it means to get to V1, and first we said it's great product design, an engaged audience, and I was saying, but also all of that is not done in a vacuum. You insert yourself into an ecosystem, and so in a way you need to disrupt this ecosystem somehow. So to talk about that, I want to invite Kristen Berman, who's the co-founder of Irrational Labs. Irrational Labs is a think tank and a consulting firm that specializes in behavioral economics. And really what Kristen is trying to do is say the way you build great products, the way you release amazing stuff and disrupt industries is by understanding that humans are not rational, and so what does it mean to get people to accept something new within an existing ecosystem? So I met Kristen, I want to say a few years ago. She was at the time basically running from scratch a free course called Startuponomics, which was completely grounded in behavioral economics and how behavioral economics can help startup companies. And she was doing this just because she loved the field. And then a few years later, she started that company with Dan Ariely, and they've been consulting with Lyft, with Google, with a bunch of other companies. Anyways, she's like one of the smartest people I know, so I'm really glad that she's here. Welcome.
I usually ask people to set low expectations. It's much easier to exceed than high. So I'm going to set up right now. We're going to do a little chat on disruption. We have amazing panelists from Uber, Spotify, and Twitter in the works. While I set up, I'll tell you about them. One sec. Here we go. There we are. Actually, just kidding. So just before we begin, how many of you want to build a disruptive startup? Yeah, sounds like a nice plan, right? Let's just go and do it. So we'll talk a little bit about what disruption means, some theories around it, and then kick off a really interesting panel about how other people have or haven't done it. But first, sorry guys. But first we'll look at my Word docs. We will watch Fosbury Flop. Oh, this is not it. That's not it. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about Fosbury. Oh, there we go.
The 1968 Olympic Games proved to be a turning point in the history of the high jump event. Into the Mexico City Olympic arena came not only a new name to the sport, but a new approach, which was to revolutionize the high jump event. Dick Fosbury from the United States demonstrated a new style of high jump, which some considered strange and awkward. It was a jump he had devised in the previous years, and one which unsettled his opponents. While the crowd at first saw him as a novelty, his continued success at clearing the ever-increasing height soon made it apparent he was a serious contender. Valentin Gavrilov from the Soviet Union failed at his attempt of 2.22 meters, while Fosbury and his US teammate Edward Carruthers cleared their way to a jump-off. The bar sat at 2.24. Carruthers failed, and Fosbury took his new style over the bar and into the history books. Fosbury had won his gold. Within a few years, the Fosbury flop had become the standard method of jumping in this great Olympic sport.
Yeah. Let's switch back. So basically, this is how cool is this, right? This dude just like comes on the scene. Everyone else in this Olympics is investing. They're starting to invest in the running shoes, the equipment. They're spending a lot of money. This guy does none of that. He just like flops over the bar and takes over the sport. Like that's pretty disruptive. And according to Clay Christensen, so Clay Christensen, this master of disruption, the professor, maybe in context with Michael Porter, master of disruption would probably agree, say something, this is my favorite quote, "This is not a missed opportunity. It's not like a plane takes off without you. You didn't even know there was a plane. You wandered into this meadow, which you thought, or you wandered to the airfield you thought was a meadow, and the plane ran you over." Like, like this is exactly what Fosbury did, right? He basically said, you guys are spending money on something. I'm going to create a new way to do something. And oh, by the way, in 5 years, his competitors were using it. So Clay Christensen's theory of disruption basically is that something new comes into the market, cheaper, lower cost, and takes over the incumbents. And the question is this correct? And we can actually ask Fosbury this. So back in the day when the Clay Christensen stuff was coming out, the Fosbury story was actually the #1 story that innovation workshops would tell. And then what happened is that they actually talked to the dude. They talked to the man and said, how did you do it? How did you create this amazing flop of yours? And what did he say? He said, oh, like through practice. So what happened was he actually started with something called the scissors kick and then made incremental improvements over time with the scissors kick. So while everyone else was doing the straddle jump, and that was where the field was moving, he said, you know what, I'm not really good at that straddle jump. I'm just going to stick to this scissors kick, and kept doing it. And then over time, kicked his hips out a little bit and like lifted his legs. And even his coach said he had no idea that this was happening, that he was inventing the flop, because it was so incremental and so methodical that it just happened. And not only that, this whole thing, the researchers said, you know, well, maybe it's just these innovation workshops who are making this up and saying, wow, this flop is really cool. But what happened, they surveyed these sports experts, and they're the ones saying that actually this incremental innovation is the most innovative thing in the past history of sports over running shoes. So now we kind of have this dilemma as we think about what is disruption. If we want to do it, we have to understand this theory of disruption so that we can replicate it. And the question is, we have two fairly competing views, right? We have this idea of Clay Christensen disruptive model, and we have the incrementalism of the Fosbury flop. And so how would you figure out a theory? So right now I work a lot with academics. We think in a very academic experimental mindset. And for us, if we were to ask this question, we'd say, obviously, if you have a question, what do? You do an experiment, you isolate all the variables, you have a control, you get a lot of data sets, or get a lot of data points, and now you know your answer. And with this whole disruption thing, this is just not feasible, right? You can't really isolate markets, you can't really isolate startups, and you certainly can't isolate them at the same time to get enough data points. In fact, the people who try to do it, what we'd be missing is this idea of that 75% of startups fail. So we're not even, if we were to think about the theory of disruption and have something that we would prove, we'd miss all the people that actually just failed at it, and we'd only catch the data points of the people that worked. So the question is really, what is the theory of disruption? So kind of in the essence of theorizing with us today, I looked and said, how would an academic think about this? And it turns out that we actually do have an approach that says we should really be more systematic about this. And now what I'm about to tell you is a framework, and we want to think about this like the Russian theory of creativity. Right? There are steps, there are processes. This is a systematic approach to innovation and disruption, but it's an approach nonetheless, and we can take it for what it is. So this is basically saying that in one world, there's form follows function, design is first. In this world, this Russian theory of innovation, we have function following form. Instead of figuring out customer needs, what this approach says is that you should actually look at product attributes. Not a bad place to start. If you were to start somewhere looking and understanding the product, this seems like a fairly reasonable spot to start. So step one in this approach is basically that every product has different attributes. So there are internal attributes, and your job is to systematically write down all of the attributes of your product, internal. So these are things that you can control. Its shape, its size, its color. And there's this whole environment thing going on that you can't control. It's maybe the environment where you're using the product, or it's your actual user. So it's like the height, the strength of the user, the person who's engaged with your product. And by doing some magic, you can kind of create innovation and disruption. So you can combine them, you can create dependencies, you can subtract them, you can add them, and magic will happen. Here's how it works. So if you were to think about an attribute, something like children's clothes or a baby and infant's clothes, and you say, what are the attributes of an infant's clothes? You have things like color and size, but let's just take color. And you combine this with the actual user, the infant. You say, what are the attributes of the infant? One of the attributes of the infant is temperature. And currently, these things do not connect. In the world of babies' clothing, in the previous world, there was no connection to temperature. But what happens when you do connect them? Well, it turns out that temperature is one of the biggest predictors of an infant's health. And so if a clothing could give you an early warning to temperature, perhaps you could disrupt this market of taking your child in every time that there's a potential red flag. So that's just what happened. There's this clothing, it gets the baby's temperature. Like looking at this is also, how many of you have ever tried transition sunglasses? Yeah, the same thing, right? You say you have lenses, you have outside lighting, and if we combine the color of your lenses with the outside lighting, perhaps we can decrease the number of glasses that you need from 2 to 1. Yeah, you're just combining two attributes. It's a very simple process. Let's try this again. So think about just your average chair. And we have user attributes from the chair. We have things like the height of it, the shape of it, the size of it, the width of it. And then we have attributes from the user who's sitting in the chair. They also have a height, they have a size. How would we combine them to form something completely new and different? So what these guys did is say, we're going to combine the height of the chair and the height of these things are currently not connected. It's a linear line. They are not connected in any way. And yet, when you have this office chair, now you connect the height of the chair and the height of the person, and you can go up and down. And short people can get a little bit lower of a chair, and taller people can get a little bit higher of a chair. And you've created this dependency that didn't exist before and somewhat of a product innovation to the normal chair. Okay, so this is kind of where thought experiment continues of like, okay, we've got these great companies in the valley. We have some of them here with us. How should we think about disruption in this manner? So if you think about Twitter and what it disrupted, it kind of disrupted this idea of journalism or media generally. And what are the attributes of journalism or media? We have this idea of like the length of an input field. So Twitter has the length of an input field as being an attribute, but generally journalism is you have a field in which you write. And they connected this with this idea of the writer's ability to write. And what does that actually look like? It means these people who were not journalists at all, people who had no experience writing, were now disrupting the media by becoming the coverage, by becoming the news, because of this short input field. Right? Because they were able to write a very short little thing, their writing ability was connected with this field, and they disrupted this idea, and we'll hear more about this later, this idea of journalism. Okay, thought exercise number 2, we've got this idea of Spotify. A lot of arguments of who Spotify disrupted. We'll hear more from them. But there's radio, and radio is like full access to songs, right? It's free. Full access to songs in your car. And so how would Spotify think about disrupting radio? Full access songs plus control, right? You say, in this world, you're combining the variables, and now you have something where I can control my playlist. It's not the DJ. I can control the genre that I listen to. I can control how long I listen to it, in what sequence. And this kind of combination of variables then got them fundamentally a different value proposition. Okay, so we can theorize again about Uber and their theory and their combination matrix, but it may be more fun to think about the future of Uber. Anyone have any ideas for how you could combine, subtract, add? What kind of things could we combine? What attributes could we play with for Uber? Yep. So we'd have to probably pick out like two variables there. So that may be something like wait time. You have to call somebody, and then this idea of on-demand control. Yep. Yeah. So the attribute then that we're thinking about really is this idea of location plus wait time. And we're combining them in a way. And when we think about this and we go through this creative process, because I really like this idea after going through all these examples, is that we actually want to think about new variables to combine. So how can you take something wildly separate and then combine them? or subtract or add. Anyone else want to like guess at what a future of Uber could look like in this model of disruption? Yeah, so that's interesting. So we're basically saying that we have this idea of connecting safety with the actual rider or the driver. And before, you'd get in a car and you don't necessarily think that there's no concept of connecting the safety or the background check of the user who's in the car or of the driver. Yep. So back there, yeah. Yep. Yep. So then you're even kind of just changing the rider there. You're saying the person who's riding has a family. One attribute of them is a family, and that they also have places to go. So there's some location and then a family member, and you're connecting them. Mm-hmm. Before we leave, yep. Non-human delivery. No, this is wonderful. So packages. So basically you're saying we'll connect this thing that a person has in their possession and the route that a driver is going. And by these two things being connected, we can fundamentally disrupt something like a UPS. How cool. Yeah. Yep, exactly. Which not like Lyft may or may not be trying to do as well. Last one. Yeah, so maybe they're your actual your car always. So you basically say I need to get somewhere in a very quicker time, and Uber can do this. Okay, so the other way to think about this, we've combined variables, we made them dependent. What if we were to subtract an attribute from the car? The driver, the steering wheel, what would happen? Driverless cars. So which I think is a very interesting thought exercise. You say if we're in a closed situation, which this researcher Jacob Goldberg basically said, we get in a closed situation and we say, let's look at the attributes around us. Can we combine them? Can we make them dependent? Can we remove them? And what actually would happen? So we basically say, wow, disruption's really interesting, but it is actually very hard to predict. There's all these theories out there. We've got this academic thought exercise going on that's a systematic approach. We've got the idea of Clay Christensen's big changes for disruption, undercutting the market. And then we have the Fosbury flop, which is incrementalism to a T. And we say, how could we actually predict the world? And what actually would create a disruptive startup? And we'll ask the panelists this. But to end, just a quick thought exercise. And I've never done a sports analogy before, so you'll have to forgive me if I get something wrong. But we can think about this, like, who are really good coaches that make their teams win? So the New England Patriots, Bill has tied for the most postseason coaching victories of all time. In the last 25 years, the Patriots have won the Super Bowl the most in 25 years. That's huge, right? This guy is obviously doing something right. How the heck can his team have such a sustaining innovation of winning? Okay, let's just study this. Let's just think together about what actually Bill's doing. So if you think about one of the major pieces of football, you have defense, and one of the best things that defense can do is recover an interception or make an interception. These are the things why I shouldn't do sports analogies. You get an interception and you say, this is actually fundamental. And so the Patriots, they had a data scientist and said, actually, if you try for interceptions 40% of the time, try for sacks 20% of the time, and the rest play safe, what's going to happen? You're going to win 17% more. That's huge. You're going to win 17% more. So this data scientist goes to Bill and says, here, guess what I have? I have this news that says, if we do this, we will win 17% more. And what does Bill say? He says, no, thank you. And his reasoning may be the same as many big companies, which is, yes, you're telling me that we're going to increase by 17% our likelihood of winning, but we also have higher variance. We have a 1% more chance of not going to the playoffs. So we move from 1% to 2% chance of not going to the playoffs, and guess what? That's just too risky. It's not worth it for me to take that risk, even though you're telling me about this potential upside of winning. And so we say, like, is Bill right? Or will somebody come and disrupt him? Kind of like the story of hope and change and disruption that we all want to hear. In the last 2 years, the Seahawks and the 49ers have led the league in interceptions, and they've also won the Super Bowl. So it's possible that taking risk actually is a way to take out the incumbent. And it's also possible that maybe Bill has a longer-term strategy and he'll be in it to win it for longer. So with that, let's think together with the folks on the panel about not only theories of disruption, but then also how we can be disruptive ourselves, and if you're in a big company, how you can be the Bill and sustain your empire. Yeah. Q&A. What would you like to know? Sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Totally. So basically what we're doing here is thought exercises, because the theory of disruption is not something you can control for, is what I'm kind of hypothesizing with us, is that actually controlling for all variables. Now football is going to be easier, right? But generally controlling for all variables in a system like this is virtually impossible. So what we can do is look for leading indicators. We can look for correlations. We can look for proof later on. I'm not trying to propose that basically because the Seahawks have the interceptions, that that's the right strategy either, but we're saying there's two different strategies to two different types of that have ended up in disruption. So what we'll hear from companies is like, oh, you should do this because that's the disruptive way to be. And the reality is, actually, we don't know, right? There's no systematic way that we've figured out that would lead to disruption. Saying, oh, you should do interceptions, that's not maybe the goal, but maybe Bills isn't either because he hasn't been in the Super Bowl for 4 years. So I think it is correlation, and that's actually kind of the point.
Is open.
Yeah. So I think that, well, the industries that we should be looking at right now for disruptive stuff would be something like the online education area, where you say, what's going to happen to Harvard? We can look at news media and journalism to say what's going to happen to journalism, who's going to disrupt Twitter, but really we still have, the Financial Times, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal trying to figure out their monetization strategy. I think those actually are, if you were to think about two kind of big industries, I think banks are ripe for this general disruption. We have financial institutions kind of stuck in a very lethargic manner, and yet they could control the market. And so you're seeing all these people like Lending Club and Prosper come up to take the lending market. You're seeing the Mint and the Level of the world to come up to take understanding of our finances. You're seeing LearnVest and others to take responsibility for our planning. You're seeing Wealthfront come in from the other end to take our investment. And you say, what actually platform do the banks have? Because their previous goal was actually being the connecting community around people. And if they're not able to do that platform, then how are they able to take that incremental revenue for holding our money?